So some claim that Jesus' resurrection is just a remix of a far older and more ancient tale. I'm talking, of course, about Inanna's Descent from 2,500 years before in the ancient land of Mesopotamia, where Inanna chooses to descend to the underworld, remains there for 3 days, and then is brought back with a resurrection involving bread and water of life. But is this really the case, or is this just a myth about myth? Let's dive into the facts and evidence and see what we can find. In the Sumerian tale Inanna's Descent, the goddess of love and war chooses to descend into the underworld of her own free will. She passes through the 7 gates, removing an item of clothing or power at each until she arrives completely unarmed and powerless before her sister, the ruler of the underworld, Ergo. There, the judges of the underworld execute her and hang her body on a hook to decay. This is not a crucifixion, and there's no mention of sacrifice. Inanna is judged and executed for attempting to usurp underworld power. Her attendant, Ninshubur, waits 3 days and 3 nights as instructed, and when Inanna does not return, begins pleading with the gods to refuse, but Enki, the god of wisdom, creates 2 tiny beings and equips them with the water of life and the plant of life. They travel to the underworld, sprinkle the life-giving substances on Inanna's corpse after comforting Ergo, and Inanna revives. But as Inanna attempts to leave the underworld, the demons detain her. She has to find a replacement and chooses her husband and lover in life, Dumuzi. All right, now that we have the groundwork for Inanna's Descent and the story itself, let's compare and contrast the 2 tales. We're gonna do this in rapid fire format, so stick with me. So why do they both go into the underworld? Inanna goes to expand her power and confront her sister, Ergo. Inanna wants to expand her influence and her power beyond the limits of the grave. But ultimately, that's shut down. She's not able to complete that task. Versus Jesus, why does Jesus go? Why does he die? He goes to willingly give his life as a ransom for many, to fulfill prophecies dating all the way back to Genesis 3. Let's compare how they died. Inanna is killed in the underworld itself and hung on a meat hook in the underworld. Jesus is publicly crucified in a known place called Golgotha, just outside of Jerusalem. He's crucified under Roman law, where he is physically seen by followers and enemies alike. How were they raised from the dead? Inanna was resurrected by others. She was resurrected thanks to the 2 figures that Enki creates that go to Ergo and comfort Ergo. Only by Ergo's permission is Inanna allowed to return, and then the demons of the underworld insist that Inanna must find a substitute for who is going to take her place. Versus Jesus, who is raised by his own authority, and the Bible claims that he has so much authority that it wasn't just him that raised from the dead. Whether you want to believe it or not, the Bible claims that there were many others that were resurrected as well at the time of Jesus, and it wasn't just Jesus himself. So Jesus embodied so much power that he brought people with him from the dead. That's a big difference compared to Inanna. What about time frame? In the beginning of the video, I said that Inanna was in the underworld for 3 days, but this is not quite correct. It's a bit of an assumption here. The text only states that Inanna was in the underworld for 3 days before her servant Ninshubur goes out to seek aid from the other gods. So while it's possible Inanna was in the underworld for 3 days, it's far more likely that it was actually more time, that Inanna might have even been there for a whole week before Enki finally decides to intervene and sees the chaos going on in the world due to Inanna's absence. Now let's compare that to Jesus, where in the Gospels, it claims that Jesus rode specifically on the 3rd day, fulfilling both older prophecy and his own prediction. All right, next up we have a correlation argued between Inanna being sprinkled with the water of life and the bread of life, and then Jesus' Last Supper. So let's dive into this one here a little bit. First up, Inanna is brought to life with the water being placed on her, and then the bread, which is also sometimes translated as plant, being placed on her as well. It says nothing about consuming it. Versus if we look at Jesus' Last Supper, the emphasis is on consuming wine and then consuming bread. It's a big difference, especially since the people that are consuming these things are the living. But what about historicity? Because we have to look at the viability of both of these characters being historical figures. And while it's possible Inanna was indeed a true figure, and there may be things we're missing about our ancient past and how spirituality and Hades works, it's a mythic poem with symbolic meaning. John Hayes notes that the Mesopotamians didn't have a formal method of keeping history, and so we don't know where the line of history ends and where the line of myth begins. Versus Jesus, where we have the Gospels documenting exactly what happens to him, and then we have multiple other Roman historians acknowledging that Jesus at least existed. These are apples to oranges, it's not the same. Which, talking about apples and oranges, let's transition into logical fallacies. All right, so this premise actually commits a number of different logical fallacies, and we're going to be breaking down the biggest three right here. First one up is post hoc ergo propter hoc, and that is basically saying that because this, therefore that, with no clear link between the two. So what this one here is saying in this instance is because Inanna's Descent has a resurrection and all these other vaguely similar features, Jesus' story copied that. We can't assume such a thing. It's not the case. That's like trying to argue how correlation equals causation. We can't do that. They're two different things. This could just as easily have been two true tales that happened in very different instances and very different times that stem from people wrestling with the same issues of life, death, and resurrection. There's a number of different explanations that we could spin off of this, but saying that one follows the other and that therefore one copied the other, that's a huge leap that we just can't take in logic. So the next one up's a category error. John Hayes, in his manual for Sumerian cuneiform that I'm working through, points out that the Mesopotamians didn't have what we would define as a traditional method for keeping history. Their history got encoded into mythology. And so it's a category error to compare something that is clearly myth, that we don't even know if Inanna existed for sure or not, with Jesus, who we know at the very least existed historically because of Pliny the Elder, Tacitus, and I think there's one other attested Roman historian that credited Jesus as well. So we can't take myth compared with confirmed viable history and then equate the two. It's a category error. All right, last one, piggybacking off of the category error, is the false equivalence fallacy, where it's you take two things that aren't actually the same, and then you try to compare them as if they are the same. In this instance, comparing them as if one copied the other. We can't compare the two. Superficial parallels don't make two things the same thing, the same myth. It's like comparing apples to a burning bush. It just doesn't work. Drop a comment below if you think we missed any logical fallacies, or if you disagree. We want to hear from you. Is there an angle that we missed on all of this? But in conclusion, I'd say that I think it's pretty clear that Jesus didn't just remix a Mesopotamian myth. He lived his own story. His resurrection stands alone, logically, theologically, and historically. See you in the next video.